evening. It was somebody's turn to be on mute, and clearly that was mine. So I hope we have it all out of the way for everybody. It's allowed us for a few more participants to come in. Welcome. My name is Johanni Grossman. I'm the team leader at the Basel Institute on Governance. Our team focuses on what we call green corruption, and that is also the topic of this series. The series is called Corrupting the Environment. This is the 5th iteration already of discussions that we've had, where we look at the intersection of corruption, environmental degradation, and the illicit trade. We, of course, thank the OECD for the partnership, the excellent partnership that we've had in the last 6 months that these discussions have been taking place. And today's discussion is of particular interest, I think, because it focuses on a topic that is quite adjacent to a trend that we've all experienced, which is the move online, because here we are online discussing this issue. And environmental crime has also moved online. We have seen a number of trends in this regard. And of course, the one that's particularly relevant for us here today is the online sale of illicit environmental goods. A very prominent element here is wildlife, but not exclusively. And the topic, this particular topic, the online sale, is gaining quite a bit of prominence. There was a congressional hearing in the United States just a few weeks ago on this issue by the Subcommittee on Waters, Oceans, and Wildlife, which highlighted the complexity of the matter. The, of course, growing shift towards sales online, but also the challenges that are contained in regulating the online marketplaces. Obviously, a lot of that sale is out in the open, and we'll have experts talk about that in great detail today. And then, of course, the challenges that relate not just to regulating, but also to investigating and enforcing and tracing the illicit goods that are being sold online. So we have a fantastic panel here today. I will not spend any more time talking about this topic because they know far more about it than I do. And to start, we have Simone Haysom, who is going to speak about the online sale of environmental goods using open platforms, using social media and other open platforms, which is really a very, very prevalent way, a surprisingly prevalent way. At least as I started looking into it, I was surprised how easily these things are available and how easy it is to find them. Simone is a senior analyst with the Global Alliance Against Transnational Organized Crime. And she leads the global initiative's work on online illicit markets in illegal wildlife products. She's also working on a project using machine learning technology related to the online sale, which sure she'll tell us about it. She's held positions with the Overseas Development Institute and been engaged on academic research projects with the University of Oxford, despite having a degree from Cambridge, and the University of Witwatersrand. Simone, if I can hand it over to you, can you comment on the latest trends in this field of online sales during the pandemic? We know that this is something you've been tracking for years, but I'm curious whether in the last year or so you've seen significant changes here.
Thanks very much, Johanni, and thanks very much for having me on this panel. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so pertinent to put this question of the online wildlife trade, sort of ask about it in relation to the pandemic, because at the start of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was so much discussion about the potential role of pangolins as a carrier host. And there was so much discussion then about regulation of the wildlife trade and stricter measures that countries could take. And yet, I think, as you've mentioned, sort of the most pronounced trend that we can really see is this shift to doing more things online. And that has really come out of the movement restrictions, the closure of brick and mortar retail outlets, which meant that even people who were holdouts for e-commerce have had to learn how to use the platforms, have put their credit card details online, have become comfortable operating in the online sphere. And I think it's useful to sort of slightly step back and look at the degree to which that's really been a pronounced trend over the last year. Earlier this month, UNCTAD released a report that looked at 7 OECD economies and showed an almost 25% growth in the value of online retail sales between 2019 and 2020. And what's more, that represented a 3% increase in online retail sales share of total retail sales. So that's commerce being taken out of the offline realm into the cyber realm. And those sort of trends are observable globally as well. There are individual countries who are not highly developed, which have seen massive upticks in the use of e-commerce. And people are also not only buying more things online, as you said, we're also working more online. People are receiving medical consultations online, psychology sessions online. There's really just been a pronounced acceleration of an existing trend to do many things that were previously offline online. And that last point is important because the issue of cyber IWT is not only about direct sales, it's also about socialization. It's about norm formation, and it's often about community building around particular species and their purchase. And I think it's important to underscore that because it's both an underappreciated aspect of the issue, and it's also sort of directly relates to why it's so problematic that this phenomenon is so widespread on the most mainstream platforms, that you can buy an endangered species on Facebook at the same time that you're catching up with an old high school friend, or you are reading a news article about the latest COVID outbreak somewhere in the world. I think this shift is really the climate rather than the weather when we're talking about the role and scope and the difficulty of this issue. In so many other issues that we research at the Global Initiative, we find that illicit trade tracks trends in legitimate trade. So I think even where we don't have the baselines, we can really expect that this is going to show up with cyber IWT as well. And also to slightly step back, before I go into talking about 2 recent case studies that we've done, the acceleration of that trend is particularly a problem because there was already a constellation of different factors which came together, which meant that the internet posed a particular threat to endangered wildlife. Many of those relate to really the broader problem of cybercrime and inadequate international response to it. One of those is the massive global under-resourcing of cybercrime responses. Second is the extremely slow pace of building government regulation of the cybersphere, which derives from, I think, really weak political leadership on the issue. And then cutting across both of those inadequate legal frameworks. And if you look at those 3 problems, which are problems across many crime types, and you apply them to wildlife, they're either particularly complex or particularly neglected. When it comes to law enforcement and the response to cyber IWT, law enforcement is already overwhelmed by the scale of child sexual abuse content online, by the scale of cyber fraud, by various online harms. And we have been quite directly told by law enforcement officers that the wildlife trade is really at the bottom of the list of priorities in a context of stretched resources. When we look again at sort of political leadership on the issue, I think there's some shift around this, but wildlife generally hasn't been a major priority for a lot of governments, and it's not an issue that commands an obvious constituency. And then again, when you turn to legal frameworks for all the inadequacies of sort of cyber regulation, the wildlife trade itself has an extremely fragmented, complex international regulatory regime that's often underdeveloped. And taken all together, that's really a perfect storm. So that's why you see so easily just the IWT occurring with a huge amount of impunity on both e-commerce platforms and on social media, and really a whole range of different platforms that aren't always brought up in this conversation. Classified sites have become really a major place that we find this content, business-to-business wholesaling and catalog sites as well. Which is all a preamble to kind of say that I'm going to talk about two specific studies into species and their markets in particular parts of the world, or in particular languages, because that's also one of the dynamics of how the internet operates. We think about it being totally globally interconnected, but in some really practical ways, it's very fragmented by language. And we as an organization have tried to deal with that by developing a tool, by using machine learning technologies with our partners, the Center for Social Media Analysis, who are based in London, which can apply a set of processes to understand where and how commercial activity related to the wildlife trade is happening. And that involves both finding direct advertisements for wildlife products, as well as finding the kind of conversations that socialize people into trade or prepare people for having a conversation that moves offline where trade is concluded. We call this tool the Cascade, and it forms the basis of our evidence base for other activities around engaging with the private sector, engaging with law enforcement, to try and actually shift the dynamics of these markets. We've recently looked at two markets that I think have quite a sort of key relationship to this question of the wildlife trade and zoonotic diseases. And the one is the African grey parrot trade. We were looking at the trade for the pet market. And we very specifically looked in a place that isn't often the focus of a lot of these cyber investigations. We were looking in African states, particularly range states and states adjacent to range states. And that came out of conversations with the World Parrot Trust, who's one of the partners that we work very closely with on this work, who had in fact observed in Nigeria, which is a range state where African grey parrots are highly protected by national legislation, adverts on classified type e-commerce platforms, which very directly indicated cross-border trade, which would be a violation of CITES protocols. And there was really a question mark about whether with rising levels of economic growth, growing middle classes and growing internet penetration, there were markets for pets developing, which is a set of factors that we've seen in various parts of the world coming together in particular ways to create, in places where there weren't previously, those type of live animal markets, a demand. And the results of the study were very interesting. For one, we found the largest market in a country that hadn't been on our partners' radars, even though they're doing very scrupulous sort of monitoring of various platforms for the trade in this bird. That was much larger than expected. We found also a substantial number of adverts in Nigeria, where the bird, as I said, actually has quite good national protection, and a very clear implication of 3 platforms where this material was occurring, and albeit to varying degrees in different countries. Platforms which are not members of the Global Coalition, which have too small a membership to be on the radar for those types of interventions, and all platforms which have policies which prevent or should prevent that material appearing. And always manifesting in a way that wouldn't actually be difficult for the platform to detect. You know, they're not using keywords, it's not hidden, it's not, you know, the only thing that the sellers are being dishonest about is the ease of keeping an African gay parrot as a pet. They're not hiding that they're selling it. Their phone numbers are on the adverts for people to contact them. We're also in the midst of analyzing now quite large data set that came out of a study on looking for products containing pangolin scale. This is, in a way, quite a different market. Parrots is live animals, pets. They have particular dynamics, of course, about the sort of offline supply chains around them. The products that were primarily the focus of this second pangolin study are processed products sold by often recognized brands and primarily on pharmacy sites or on aggregators, e-commerce aggregators. That study had come out of previous work that we'd done a couple of years ago, looking for pangolin scales, sort of any material containing pangolin, which had really identified these pharmacy sites as sort of the primary places where those products were marketed. This time we looked in 3 languages, so Chinese, Vietnamese, and English. And we have over 2,300 candidate detections. There's a process of triage and analysis going on, that at the end of which we hope to have, I think, a fairly informative picture of the landscape of sort of advertisement and marketing and access to pangolin products. Some of which can still be very legally sold in China, but some of these sites may be based outside the Chinese mainland, maybe delivering to places outside the Chinese mainland, which would, again, be a clear CITES violation. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Juhani, I could go on to some of our other monitoring on Facebook or...
Yeah, I think that would be relevant. I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you about is, you know, what are the platforms actually doing about this? I mean, I know that the space is gigantic and the challenges are vast, but nonetheless, we keep hearing about all these thousands and tens of thousands of content monitors being hired and new algorithms being applied. So I'm curious what you've seen. I know that there is global coalitions to address this issue, but they've been in place for a few years now. And it seems from your reports, from the 2 examples that you just cited, that this is an ongoing issue nonetheless. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the trends are, what the platforms are doing, and how effective in your assessment that is.
Yeah, so I think that this is quite a dynamic space at the moment. So there is a global coalition to end wildlife trafficking online, I believe it's called. GITOC is not a member of that, but there are several conservation NGOs who are. It aims to link conservation experts with major e-commerce and social media companies. There are 34, some Chinese, some European, North American, representing some of the largest e-commerce companies in the world. And their most recent progress report had quite impressive statistics in it. They said that the companies had taken down over 3 million postings. They'd collected over 1,000 keywords. I find those numbers encouraging, but extremely hard to evaluate because we really don't know what the total number of adverts are. They don't give outsiders access to the content that's been removed. This is actually a frequent complaint or a catch-22 that people who are concerned about this issue face, because if you flag content to companies, their usual response is to delete that content. So it doesn't get stored for law enforcement action. So there's definitely a trade-off between there being law enforcement action and there being a response from private companies. companies are definitely flagging keywords. Companies like Instagram have pop-ups which come if you search for certain animals. Some companies have also run consumer education campaigns. I think those are all good steps for companies to take. However, Facebook, for example, recently changed its community engagement policy to say that there could be no trade whatsoever in endangered species. We think that's incredibly positive because it cuts out the ambiguity about what's strictly illegal and what isn't, which is almost impossible often to tell purely from an online interaction. At the same time, there are partners that we work with who are actively engaging people selling whole pieces of ivory and rhino horn on their Facebook profiles, in their stories, auctioning to groups of thousands. Things like that don't give you confidence that the private companies are really on top of the issue. I think also, implicitly, the companies are quite happy to have a conversation about what they're doing or what they're not doing, as long as that conversation stays within the ambit of voluntary measures. And a lot of how the coalition and the engagements that we also have with the companies, in which our partners have with the companies, rely a lot on NGOs, citizen scientists spotting adverts and making them aware of what's going on. I think if you match the trends that I was talking about previously, about the growth in people's use of these platforms, the growth in the reach of these platforms, people's greater comfort doing things online, the also socialization that comes with seeing what should be highly illegal products sort of openly advertised on otherwise family-friendly forums. There would need to be a massive investment, and there isn't anything now to compel companies to make that massive investment.
Thank you, Simone. That's a very succinct and clear note to pause at. I've written down actually one of the questions I want to ask the group later, based on what you just mentioned, because I think it will be very interesting. But let's move on to our second speaker, and then we'll get back to the Q&A at the end. Simone, of course, talked about the open online platforms that anybody can have access to. And in fact, just this morning, I typed in pangolin scales, and lots of opportunities to buy pangolin scales just on the open web. And if we are optimistic, which I think we should all be, then let's hope that a solution to this will occur either through voluntary regulation or tougher regulation from the state that would start cracking down on this. And so one of the topics that has been discussed for a while, and there have been various reports on this, is how about the less public sides of the internet, the deep and the dark web. How is the situation there with the sale of illicit environmental goods in general and wildlife in particular? And a report a few years ago concluded there wasn't a whole lot of it happening. And so I'd be very keen to hear from our next expert, Jose Antonio Alfaro Moreno, from Europol, where he is a team leader at the European Serious Organized Crime Center, to hear whether that trend you think has changed over the recent years, where you think it will go as there's increasing pressure on the open and public platforms, but also what the governments and regulators can do about that. So just to introduce Jose Antonio briefly, he comes obviously with a high degree of experience. He spent 16 years before Europol at the Guardia Civil in Spain, including 9 years as a senior investigator at Seprona, which is Spain's Environmental Protection Unit, where he was a senior investigator. And I think Europol doesn't need an introduction. Of course, it's the European Police Agency, which, unlike other international agencies, is very actively involved in facilitating actual ongoing cases, and has had a number of successes in regards to wildlife trafficking networks. So Jose Antonio, tell us what are your analysts, what are your observers seeing in terms of trends in the less public parts of the internet, in terms of selling illicit environmental goods? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, the prevalence, but also what type of sellers and buyers are there? Are the profiles similar to the ones that we see in the public platforms, or are they different? Over to you, Jose Antonio.
Okay, thank you, Johanny, for this kind invitation. I'm glad to be here on behalf of Europol in order to briefly provide you some highlights concerning our work and what is happening there concerning this topic. Well, short answer is yes. Why yes? It's important to give a brief background of what's happening nowadays with environmental crime. Investigators, we are used to saying that environmental crime is a very big elephant in a tiny room, which everybody is noticing, but no one realizes that the elephant is right there. This is how we feel. I mean, for years, we have not been the most important topic concerning enforcement, as a matter of fact, but nowadays, it's changing. 4 years ago, for instance, in the EU, environmental crimes were declared as one of the priorities concerning the fight against organized crime. It means something. It means something is moving because the declaration of environmental crime as a priority means the immediately a sort of proliferation, a sort of movement concerning operational activities. There is a platform. You have all the information in our website. You have a platform called Impact, led by the member states of the European Union and our associated parties from all over the world. And they carry out concrete operational actions concerning concrete phenomena involving environmental crimes. And cybercrime activities are part of these actions and measures. So immediately when you release a project like this, immediately you have some results. So is it showing a trend? In my opinion, no. It's proving that the crime existed, and nowadays someone is taking care of the crime. Then I am talking about 4 years ago, hardly 4 years ago, when the Impact platform was released in end of 2017. So it's too early to say if there is a trend or not, because we have to build the basis of the work in order to draft the real intelligence picture of what is happening. Then after a few years, I think we can say it's happening, there is a trend, it's concerning or not, but nowadays it's too early. What is true is, as Simone mentioned, that the cyber crime specialists are too busy in probably in other criminal areas, such as financial crimes, child sexual abuse, fraud, etc., etc. Then probably a good action to be considered could be the inclusion of cyber specialists in the environmental crime teams. It's something that, for instance, in the Netherlands, it's already happening. The Dutch police includes cybercrime specialist and financial specialist in the environmental crime teams. So it's an added value because there is one of the staff members can do this work and the other staff members can do the more operational work on the ground. So it's relevant to say. According to the new priority, here in Europol, we have coordinated some relevant actions, cyber patrullings. In the past, these actions were focused on other criminal areas, but nowadays we are focusing as well on wildlife illegal trade mainly. So the short answer is yes, we are noticing that cyber crime concerning illegal wildlife trafficking is increasing, but we cannot say that it's increasing now. Probably it was happening in the past and we didn't realize. Concerning the dark web, of course, the profile of the perpetrators in the dark web is, well, let's say in few words, is more professional and probably linked to other criminal activities, such as drugs trafficking, probably firearms trafficking mainly, etc. We have noticed some relevant cases, but in my opinion, we have yet a long way to do in the regular web. I would say that the cyber component can lead from a little and probably not relevant seizure to uncover a professional organized criminal group working behind. It's happening openly that not only pangolin scales, but here in Europe we have three main priorities, which are reptiles, glass seals to Asia, and birds. And concerning reptiles and birds, we can gather good information coming from the open web. We don't have to go into deep in the dark web to notice that. It's happening because we are talking about legal commodities. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about illegal trade, but it's only the illegal trade is only banned for certain species of included in CITES. So we have to bear it in mind. We are talking about legal trade, and digging into the legal trade, probably we will find out where the wildlife trafficking is happening. So that's what I wanted to say. We have to do this work in the open web. And in this regard, I would like to mention a relevant activity, internal security funding project called EU Cyber Wildlife Project, in which WWF, Traffic, IFA, Interpol, and Netherlands, France, and Belgian activities have been working for a couple of years with good results, I would say, trying to provide training to law enforcement officers and to carry out concrete operational activities with the support that it's important and the cooperation as well of the private sector. And this is something I would like to highlight as well. The private sector has been mentioned by Simon as well. They have a responsibility here because some of the platforms are recurrent. In my times in Spain, where we were just initiating our work concerning wildlife cybercrime, the platforms were regularly the same. So it's important the involvement of the companies in order to tackle this phenomenon. In this regard, several relevant companies are cooperating in the EU Wildlife Cyber Project with good results, and we really appreciate that. And in this regard, I would like to mention that here from Europol, we would be glad to facilitate the contact with national activities or by ourselves in order to cooperate in this regard. It's quite relevant if something is detected to have previously sort of protocol in order to advise the authorities. So those are the highlights I would like to mention today. Something is moving. We are just in a very initial stage. There is a larger way to do. The good news is that we are focusing on the cyber component of environmental crime, not only wildlife trafficking, because there are other wildlife crimes which have a strong component. For instance, the illegal poisoning is, of course, there are some substances banned in certain regions in the EU, for instance, but are illegally sold by throughout the internet as well. It's important to mention because, for instance, those substances come, for instance, from Asia to Africa, sometimes via Europe or final destination in Europe, and are used by organized criminal groups focused on poaching. For instance, it's happening with elephants in Africa, and it's relevant because the substances are highly risky, not only for the fauna, but as well for the populations. So it's a really comprehensive topic, and I repeat, we are on the right way as law enforcement officers, but there is a long way to do, and here we are, just to try to support member states, and we are open to receive your contributions, and your feedback if needed.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. That's a really interesting presentation, and thank you in particular for highlighting that we're not only talking about the sale, the online sale of animals or animal products, but also the tools needed for poaching and I suppose trafficking as well. That those also have to move somehow, and it appears that they're being sold online as well. That's, I think, a very important factor to keep in mind. Again, I have a few questions, but I will save them until the end, and I'm sure our audience is also going to be sending questions in. I see some have already been coming in. But before we get to the Q&A, let's turn to our last speaker. So we've heard about the online sale. We've heard the open and deep and dark webs, but we haven't talked about the transactions and how the transactions are made and what can be done about that. And of course, at the Basel Institute, one of the things we always have in the front of our mind is the follow the money element. And of course, as Jose Antonio mentioned this as well, that the embedding of financial investigators is increasingly common, far too infrequent for my liking, but nonetheless, it's starting to happen. And of course, one of the challenges here is that as the sale takes place online, various reports show that that takes place increasingly using cryptocurrencies. And of course, those cryptocurrencies are increasingly becoming mainstream, presumably a trend that will continue given how more and more widely they can actually be used, but also how as their value increases continuously. And so one of the things that I was asking myself is, what can we do about that if the sale has already taken place? How can we actually follow the money when the sale is online and it involves cryptocurrencies? And so The person to ask these questions to is my friend Federico Paisano. He is a senior financial investigation specialist at the Basel Institute, where he works on our training team. He develops and delivers trainings on financial investigations and asset recovery, and is the lead author of our training on cryptocurrencies in particular. And he joined us 10 years ago from the Italian Financial Police, where he was a chief investigator. And he's also served in Afghanistan as part of the EU police mission as a mentor to the Minister of Interior on anti-corruption issues. So Fede, tell us, are cryptocurrencies really as anonymous as the sellers of online sellers of illicit environmental goods hope? Do they confer the protections and the anonymity that they are banking on, if I can say so? And related to that, as investigators, what can we do to follow the crypto money in these particular sales?
Thanks, Yali, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody. Of course, indeed, illegal wildlife trade is clearly trying to find new ways of moving and operating like any other criminal activity, of course. And this happens on two different fronts. First of all, we have new ways to advertise good. We just talked about it, to facilitate the trade, but also, as you correctly said, to move the funds and to launder subsequently the proceeds of crime. Now, we all know, and we've discussed this, that illegal wildlife has been on sale on platforms like eBay for at least a decade, sometimes disguised, but sometimes openly. So now I was searching some data, and I've seen that only, according to eBay, only in 2019, 165,000 of prohibited wildlife products were removed from the listings. Now, and not just eBay, we also have Facebook, Instagram, Alibaba, and so on. So like Giovanni just said before, just make a Google search for yourself and you will find tons of those advertisements. But we also seen numerous reports that now those products are available not only in the open web, but more increasingly on the dark web. So why did they move to those markets? Like, for example, Agartha is one that I recently encountered. And the reason must be found in the most difficult part, in my opinion, of the entire process, which is the payment from the buyer, because of course, nobody wants to purchase illegal products, paying with a wire transfer or with his own credit card. But, and also to the receiving part, as the laundering mechanism from the seller. Now, the advantages of going to the dark web are twofold, I would say. So first of all, is because the dark web is accessible only using Tor, so the onion router. You might have heard of it, which effectively anonymizes both the parties, the buyer IP address, so its location, its information, but also the location of the seller and the seller servers, more importantly. And also, and I think this is the key here, is that the use of cryptocurrency can bypass entirely then the financial system. That's why criminals are trying to use that in any criminal activity, but also in illegal wildlife trade, at least in some of the stages of money laundering. Now, not all of them, but many of them. Now, from an investigative point of view, does it mean that we don't have any possibility to stop this transaction? There are no remedies, and of course not. And that's what I've been trying to do in the last 10 years. And now I come also to the second question that you asked, Ioanni. So as Ioanni already know, I'm part and I represent the Basel Institute on Governance in this tripartite working group that we have together with Europol and Interpol. So it's a working group on virtual currencies and money laundering. We organize every year an international conference which hosts hundreds of law enforcement that are sharing an increasing number of successful cases and investigations in this regard. So we have many examples right now of dark web markets, which are not only seized by law enforcement. So effectively closed down. So you will see this nice advertisement of the website that says this website has been seized and people have been arrested and so on. But in some cases, and probably Jose Antonio is also aware of that, we have law enforcement who took over some of those darknet market. So we have the example of Alpha Bay, and we have other examples when the dark web market was seized. The investigators were taking over basically the administration of the website, and they let it run for another month or so just to gather information about the sellers, the buyers, and learning all the what is behind it. Okay, so very effectively, I would say that there is already the knowledge in this kind of investigation, which is increasing and increases with time, with sharing of information, which is exactly the point of our working group, and also by experience, or listening to other investigators and the way they solve some crimes. Now, I don't remember any case that was discussed in our working group relating to illegal wildlife trade, which doesn't mean that it's not happening, of course. It's probably happening in places where there is still not enough knowledge or enough understanding of how cryptocurrencies work. And that's also the other part of my work, to try and teach to law enforcement what cryptocurrencies are and how they can be investigated. And we, as I said, we are seeing that investigators are getting, and law enforcement in general, getting more knowledgeable about this. And is also often a misunderstanding by the general public and sometimes by law enforcement as well, that that cryptocurrencies are completely anonymous. Now, as Ioanni was saying, are they really so anonymous? Can they completely hide the identity of the two parties, so the buyers and the sellers? I would say that most of them, especially the most used ones like Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum, have not been designed, and this is very important, with anonymity in mind. So they try to solve a completely different purpose, okay, which was to be censorship resistant. So Bitcoin is the perfect example. And with that, I mean the ability to perform a transaction despite the fact that maybe a government or a financial institution doesn't want you to make that transaction. So that was the problem that originally Bitcoin wanted to solve. With that came some sort of anonymity, more in the form of pseudonymity, because there are pseudonyms used in cryptocurrency transaction most of the times. But other cryptocurrencies that then started a few years after that have different characteristics. And the fact that you can trace transaction, and some of them are not as visible as we would like, is why law enforcement rely, I would say, more and more on blockchain analysis companies. And those companies are able, under certain circumstances and in some cases, to de-anonymize transaction, and sometimes also to geolocate transactions. So the moment I'm making a transaction, some nodes in the network can see my location and can relay this information within the network. And this is the reason why many of those dark web markets now accept not only Bitcoin, as it was at the beginning when, for example, Silk Road was around and Bitcoin was the only currency that was used. But lesson learned, investigators were able to trace transaction, to locate the servers of Silk Road. And so now criminals are moving to other cryptocurrencies, which are more privacy oriented. I would say like Monero and Zcash are the first to come to my mind, which are not absolutely untraceable, but have a different level of anonymity. Now, here we have an important tool that is now producing its fruits, I would say, which is the intervention of standard setters, like, for example, the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, and its recommendations, in particular, 15 and 16, and the introduction of the so-called travel rule, also for cryptocurrency transaction. And FATF strongly encourages jurisdictions to change the standards and to apply different sorts of monitoring, let's say. So once criminals receive their funds, now let's imagine a transaction stemming from illegal wildlife trade. So after they receive the funds, they will have at some point to try and cash out. They will do it through one of these existing cryptocurrency exchanges. And this is becoming more and more difficult for them, since exchanges, thanks to this legal framework that FATF and other international partners are pushing on jurisdictions, have now to identify and KYC all their customers and actively monitor the transactions. So my suggestion, for example, for the financial system, or to solve and to put a better legal framework around it, is to combine two pieces of information which those exchanges and financial institutions already have, which are the red flags that trigger suspicions transaction reports or suspicious activity report. We have already in place red flags for illegal wildlife trade, which could be the background of, for example, of the person who was onboarding, or other characteristics and other, if it's a PEP, which kind of activities involved, if it deals with zoo, for example, or with the trade of other species, and red flags with crypto, which we already have. Unfortunately, they're kept into different places. So the illegal wildlife trade red flags are more on banks and normal financial institutions. The other red flags are kept by exchanges and cryptocurrencies, which could be combined. So in a case like this, and this is what I tell many times during our training programs to law enforcement, is that if this is done properly, effectively and properly, the investigation phase will be completely reversed. So rather than having, for example, an investigator trying to understand how and where the suspect was involved in illegal wildlife trade is laundering the proceeds, we have situations where a transaction is flagged as suspicious for illegal wildlife trade or money laundering. In country X, for example, Singapore or another jurisdiction, so a financial center, and the author of the transaction is identified thanks of the FATF standards. And then this information is sent back to country Y, which is where our investigators would be, because it's where the illegal activity is happening. So the poaching or the starting of the wildlife trade. And the investigator will try to, at that point, catch the criminal red-handed while he's doing the crime. So it comes, the financial flow comes before even the crime is identified. And this is what in the cryptocurrency world happens most of the time. It's not, most of the cases is not the crime that comes first, I'm investigating and I find cryptocurrency. Is sometimes I see cryptocurrency activity, I trace it back, and that leads me to the criminal activity that then I have to prove. But even in the first case, I would say that another front is obviously forensic analysis. Okay, well, where are criminals hiding the cryptocurrency if they are not keeping it in an exchange? Or where can we find the evidence that will tell us that the criminal is using cryptocurrency, is visiting certain websites, use a store, or as an account with a crypto exchange? And of course, the answer is it's devices. And I've seen that devices were the turning key in many different cases, and they were disguising and gave to the investigators a trove of information and evidence. Of course, I would say that even expert criminals sometimes would underestimate how it really difficult is to be really and completely anonymous. So sometimes even the more expert will think that they have their back covered completely, but they underestimate the amount of data that is hidden in their phone and registered by their phones and their laptops, smartwatches, and so on. Of course, an investigator is not always an expert on that field. And that's why I always try to encourage joint investigative teams where a forensic analyst or an IT expert is involved, because I think is the key to find the evidence in those cases. And that's everything I wanted to say, but I'm open for questions later on. Thanks, Irani.
Thank you, Fede, for your contribution and shining the light on something that for many of us, maybe most of us, is still an area that we're trying to understand. So we've gotten a few questions in, and we have about maybe 10 minutes or so. And I think the first question that we got from Tarun Verma, I'm just going to broaden it a little bit so it's applicable to all the speakers. Maybe everybody wants to sort of contribute a little bit to that, and I think it responds broadly to the challenge of sort of digital divide. Is that we see that the online patterns in source countries, the typical source countries and the typical destination countries are not exactly the same, in fact quite different from the ones in Europe and the United States. And I'm sort of aware that here we are with a fairly Eurocentric panel. And so I think one of the challenges that Tarun seems to want some clarification on is how all these fairly advanced requirements that we discussed today, the complicated analytics, the investigative skills, the joint investigative teams that involve cyber experts and financial investigations experts. That's not so easily available for many countries, many source countries. But then I would add to that also that of course, the online patterns, for example, in Asia, where I spent the last 10 years, are very different from the ones that we experience here. And so the relationship between the investigative skill and the degree of online activity is not the same in the different regions that we're dealing with. So I guess the question, this is a long preamble to say that the way I understand Tarun's question is, what can we do to help the countries and the partners in law enforcement or in civil society that struggle with the skill sets, with the advanced technical skill sets related to online investigations, online financial investigations and cryptocurrencies. And I know all of you are involved to one degree or the other in that element. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I don't mind
Simon?
jumping in from a kind of open web perspective, but
Great.
Yeah, I think this is such an important question, really, and I think it isn't asked often enough, and this debate isn't framed often enough in what it means for different parts of the world. And I think that, Juhani, you're partly right in that where you have the largest degree of internet access and internet use, that tends to overlap the sort of richest economies in the world, who often have the most buying power for illegal wildlife products, but then also often have more developed sort of legal frameworks and wildlife conservation authorities or police who are mandated. And also, even if they are not always doing a fantastic job, perhaps more power to stand up to corporate interests that want to resist regulation. Whereas in a lot of other countries, there are still comparatively quite, particularly developing countries and least developed countries, comparatively quite low rates of internet access, and not necessarily sort of consumer demand also changes the nature of it in different parts of the world. So as I was saying, sort of a lot of live animal trade is for pet and collector markets, which are much more associated with sort of developing economy consumer preferences. But medicinal markets, which have a very large imprint online, are not. And I think what that really calls for is monitoring, first of all. And secondly, for sort of international support towards sort of resolving some of those inequalities. I know that UNDC already does a fair amount of sort of work capacity building around cyber, not necessarily in relation to IWT, but I think certainly the inequality in terms of the resourcing of cyber enforcement is a real issue. Monitoring of the markets can also be done to a degree remotely. So if you have capacitated international organizations that are looking at these issues, they can search the markets that relate to your particular consumer markets in different parts of the world. The problem that encounters is one around language, but there are definitely internationally collaborative ways for monitoring of the markets to work, I would say.
Thank you, Simone. That's very insightful. To contrast that perspective, maybe we can go to Jose Antonio. I'm sure that you, in your work, you also collaborate with investigative agencies outside of Europe, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and what your experiences are there.
Yeah, indeed, I was thinking that the investigative tools exist already, and the communication channels exist and are already we are already working on it. As an example, for instance, I would like to mention the Jaguar network, which is a network for environmental criminal experts from the EU and Latin America. Within the context of the impact I mentioned and the support of the program El Pacto from the EU. As we from Europol, we are more focused on the operational aspect of the investigations more than capacity building. I would say that in the cyber patrolling activities, all the intelligence packages are shared with the country's consent. So I would say that we are already working on it. I repeat, we are just at the beginning here. For instance, in Europe, I mentioned that we have a long way to do. So we are no one yet to do the teachers of others. We have to be taught firstly. But the good news, one more time, is that the channels exist, because operational information cannot be shared by a simple email. You know it. We need secure channels, and those channels exist. We are in permanent cooperation with authorities worldwide, and we are now going for a new project with Asian authorities, and of course we are in permanent cooperation with Interpol. So once the channel exists, all we have to do is to provide the intelligence to the national authorities and support them as much as we could. And the answer is yes, we are on it.
Thank you very much. And your focus on operations is a perfect segue to Fede, who is, of course, focused on capacity building quite a bit. And Fede and I have had the chance to cooperate in Indonesia on building capacity in relation to crypto investigations. But maybe, Fede, you want to talk a little bit about how that process is going, and from your perspective, how much are the partners that you work with in Africa and in Southeast Asia able to apply the investigative skills? Because of course, not just from a skill and technique level, but also from an legislative environment, the situation is quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, and thanks for the question. And I mean, we work together in Indonesia, as you said, and what I've noticed also, in other countries like Africa, especially, what I noticed is that apart from obviously the lack of knowledge about cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency investigations, I mean, we are still in the early stages. Although 10 years now have passed, I know I've done my first presentations on cryptocurrency back in 2011. Basically, we are still at an early stage. There's no knowledge, especially in developing countries. Really, the investigator doesn't know anything about cryptocurrency, even if they are presented with evidence. So they found evidence in front of their eyes about crypto activity, about crypto wallets. Usually, they're not able to detect it. Okay, that's what we are trying to do, to spread that knowledge, of course. Another issue that I see, especially in developing countries, is where, and lack of funds in that case is involved, is the ability to access those tools that I was mentioning before. So we have great companies that help in tracing assets and crypto transactions. Unfortunately, that license comes with a cost that is probably insignificant for developed countries, but is quite substantial for a country like, for example, Uganda or Kenya or whatever. So I think that is a great problem that, sometimes funding and, other developing agencies can help with, because they're simply not able to access those tools and use them. And that prevents from tracing transaction, because then they will try and revert to manually trace those transactions, and they will probably discover that it's almost impossible if the laundering process has been done quite in a good way.
Thank you, Fede, for that summary. So we're almost out of time, but I want to near the end, I want to ask one more question, which I also got from the audience, which is the interaction with the companies, the online, either the social media or the online marketplaces. Simone talked a little bit in the beginning about the outstanding challenges that remain there, but I wanted to sort of throw it to all three of you in terms of both the policy, regulatory, but also the operational elements, the interactions with those platforms, especially for investigators who are not based in the same country as the platforms are based in. Do you have any, I know this is a very challenging question, but do you have any tips or suggestions on how to address that?
Do you allow me, Johanny?
Yes, please.
Well, in this regard, I think if there is a will, there is a way. The cybercrime has no frontiers. But at the end, we are talking about information collected and gathered in a legal way, which can be submitted to the competent national authority. And we, as an EU agency, it's our role to facilitate the process. It's the same with Interpol, for instance. And the channels exist. I mean, if I invite the companies to contact us, and we will try to cooperate as much as possible, and we will put them into contact with the national authorities' consent. The most important is the way the information arrives to the authority. If it's compliance with the legal framework, we can initiate an investigation. And something important concerning wildlife trafficking, big operations, big investigations, big cases come from probably insignificant seizures. This is so any little tiny piece of information can be just the beginning for a good case. It's important to be highlighted.
Thank you very much. That's an important point to make. No seizure or no piece of information is too small. Great. Do the other panelists want to add anything to that? Simone?
I suppose I would only add that I think everything Jose Antonio has said is true, but it's certainly complicated. It's not always clear that mandated authorities or companies want to receive information or have the capacity to take it on or do anything about it. And there are, of course, challenges with making contact with the right people at very large companies, which are receiving a huge amount of inquiries. But equally, this content is occurring on a vast range of platforms, and so it's a fragmented world in terms of communication. And in our work, it's really someone's full-time job to find out who to contact, to repeatedly try and make contact with them, and to try and establish those relationships. And that kind of relationship building is just an absolutely central part of the work, and a very time-consuming one.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, you make an excellent point. And in fact, one of the things I noticed in the preparation for this event was that there was quite a bit of reluctance of those companies to step out into the public and, for example, participate in this discussion. But building the personal relationships that allow for those, should I say, productive interactions to take place is, I guess, like in every sphere, quite crucial. Okay, so I think we're about out of time. Allow me to thank the panelists for a really fantastic tour de force through very complex issues. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate your time, your frankness, your openness, and I think it was very useful for. Certainly for me, but I'm sure also for our participants to learn more about the different angles of this particular issue. Clearly, it's a fast developing topic. So as we go on with the series, maybe we'll get the chance to have a check back in a while. So thank you again, everybody. I also wanted to briefly. Which is always an important element. Thank our donors who are supporting this activity and have been supporting the whole series. We have one more event that will, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, happen on the 16th of June. Focus on corruption risks in waste management. You can register on our website. And we look forward to seeing you there. That will be the last event before we take a break. So your last chance to catch up with us, if you will. So thank you very much again, everybody. I appreciate your time and your interest, and look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you very much, Ioanni, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.